Running because he was late for practice. Eric cut across the parking lot on his way to the soccer field. As he raced past the cars, something on the blacktop caught his eye. He stopped, went back, and picked it up. It was a child's plastic sword, about a foot long. It had a silver blade with the edges chipped and the tip broken off. The handle was gold painted, or had been originally. Much of the paint was gone. The grip was grooved and ended in a knob. Eric's hand was too big to hold it properly. He had no doubt that it was not lost, just discarded. Without thinking, he kept the toy in his hand and resumed his dash to the field. Several of his teammates greeted him with shouts, asking him where he'd been and why he was late. Eric fended them off with the toy sword, acting like a duelist. "En garde," he shouted. "En garde." "Let's go," the coach's voice boomed. "You're late, Eric. That's 2 extra laps when we're done." The coach crossed the field and saw that Eric had something in his hand. "What have you got there?" he said. "This?" Eric said, and the other boys began to laugh. It could have been embarrassing, but Eric wasn't that kind of boy. Inspired, defiant, he held up the tiny plastic toy and said, "This is Charlie Voyant, a sword of magic and power." "Okay, well, you can take Charlie with you when you run your laps, okay? Do you think we can start practice now?" "Now, Coach." Eric tossed the little sword on the grass by the running track, and it lay there forgotten until after practice. Then Eric found it, picked it up, and stuck it in his shorts before he began to run his penalty laps. Tom, Antoine, and Keith, 3 of his friends, played on the field, waiting for him until he was done. When he came up to them, they were each sitting on a ball, talking. Eric pulled out the little sword, held it high in the air, and said, "By the power of Charlie Voyant, I am ready to declare you all knights in his service. Are you ready to accept the challenge?" The boys laughed. "Yeah, sure," said Keith. "Do we get to rescue a damsel?" Eric lowered the sword and put the blade on Keith's right shoulder. "Then I do dub thee a loyal knight of Charlie Voyant. Do you promise and pledge to fight for him to the death?" "You bet," said Keith, "all the way." "What's this Charlie Voyant? Where did you come up with that?" said Tom. Eric shrugged. "I don't know," he said, looking at the battered toy. "It just popped into my head." He held the sword up. "Maybe that's its name," he said. "Where'd you get it?" said Antoine. "I just found it," said Eric, "back over there in the parking lot." "This is like, what do you call it, Gibraltar, that king's sword. Alfred, the one who pulled it out of the stone," said Keith. "It wasn't Gibraltar," said Tom. "That's the rock." "Hey, knight me," said Antoine. "I want to be a knight." "We could be the 3 Musketeers," said Keith. Eric put the blade on Antoine's shoulder and said, "Do you promise and pledge to fight for him to the death?" "I sure do," said Antoine. "Then you are a loyal knight of Charlie Voyant," said Eric, and he did the same with Tom. The next day Eric brought the sword to practice and knighted 2 more boys. By the next game they played, all of the boys on the team were duly knighted in the service of Charlie Voyant. The team went into that game with a 5-6 record, and they were playing the team in first place, which had only lost 1 game. Eric's team won the game 2-0, and in the locker room after the game, the coach himself consented to become one of the loyal knights of Charlie Voyant. The school name for its sports team was the Tigers, but the soccer team began calling themselves the Knights. Eric brought Charlie Voyant to every practice and every game. Before each game, the team would huddle around Eric, and he would hold out the sword with the blade pointing to the ground, and each player would reach in and grasp the handle, or another player's hand on the handle, and they would say in unison, "We are the true knights of Charlie Voyant. We play this game in his name." The Knights won, and they did not stop. They won every game on their schedule and finished the season at 12-6, making the league playoffs for the first time in their school's history. By that time, the school had taken notice of the soccer team, also for the first time in school history. Before that, football and basketball dominated the fall schedule. The only boys who played soccer were the ones who didn't make those teams, and no one paid them much attention. But the winning record combined with the story about the little toy sword, captured the imagination of the school, and students and parents and even alumni turned out in large numbers to see the Knights of Charlie Voyant play. One of the fathers of one of the players built a case for the sword out of wood with a glass top, and inside was a small mounting platform, and the case was lined with red velvet. The Knights played 3 games in the league playoffs, winning them all, along with the championship and the right to enter the state tournament. Now all of the city papers and TV and radio stations were talking about the story of this team and its magic sword, and even people from other cities were interested in it. The Knights were being called a true Cinderella team, and it seemed as if everyone in the state was wondering how long the fairy tale could last. They won 2 games, which made them regional champions. If they could win 2 more games, they would be the state champs, their dream come true. They traveled to the state capital where the semifinal and final games would be played in a huge stadium. They stayed in a motel, but many of their parents and supporters had to stay home and drive up for the games because there were no rooms available near the city. Interest in these games was so high. Never before had soccer attracted attention like this, and it was all because of the Knights and their magic sword. They had become a true Cinderella team. The semifinal opponents were the champions from the biggest city in the state. For the year, they were undefeated with 2 ties. The game was fiercely played, with neither side giving ground, and it ended in a scoreless tie. 2 overtimes also failed to produce a score for either side, so the game would be decided by a shootout. 5 players from each team would try to score on penalty shots, and the team with the most points would win. Antoine and Eric were 2 of the 5 chosen by the Knights. Keith was their goalie. Antoine had the first shot and he made it, but so did the player for the other team. The Knights' next player shot high. His ball hit the crossbar and bounced up and over. Keith kept his team in the game by making a sensational leaping save on the next kick. Then each team scored and scored again, making the score 3-3. Eric had the last shot for his team. He faked left, the goalie took the fake, and before he could recover, Eric's shot billowed the net on the right side. When the other team's 5th man shot wide on his attempt, the Knights had won, 4-3. They were in the finals. Before he left for the big game the next day, Eric went back to his room for Charlie Voyant. He could not find the sword or its case. The bus was waiting for him and the coach finally came. Eric told him he could not find the sword. The whole team left the bus and searched for the sword. I know it's been stolen, Eric kept saying. I know they stole it. No one could find the sword. Finally, the team had to board the bus and ride to the field. If they did not show up on time, they would forfeit the game. The opponent this time was the defending champions. They were a state soccer dynasty. They had won the title 8 times in the last 10 years. Beating them would be a formidable task under any circumstances, but the disappearance of the sword had clearly upset the Knights. "Should we say the thing anyway?" said Tom, and they gathered around and repeated the words, but it didn't seem the same without the sword. The coach talked to them before they left the locker room. "Listen to me," he said. "This has been an incredible season. We've done things other teams could never dream of doing. We've come so far. No matter what happens, you are all champions in my book. We've got 1 game to go now, and I know you can win it. The magic we had was not in that sword. It was in each one of you. I don't know where the sword is or what happened to it, but I know that each one of you is a knight, and I know you will fight to the death for the honor and glory of this team. Now let's go out there and show them what we can do." The Knights played hard, and the game was another scoreless contest until there was less than a minute to play. Then one of the referees blew his whistle and called a handball on one of the Knights in the penalty area. The team and the coach protested the call, but to no avail. The other team was awarded a penalty kick, and their star player won the game on a ball that Keith had no chance of reaching. All of the Knights were crying in the locker room, and the coach made no speeches, knowing there was nothing more he could say. He spoke to each boy individually, telling them what a great season it had been, one he'd never forget. The boys nodded their heads, tears dropping from their eyes. On the bus back to the motel, Eric stared out the window and said bitterly, "We'd have won if they hadn't stolen Charlie Voyant." And he believed that, every day of his life.